Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Yeah, the wise guys are ruling the global economy, and nobody knows nothing. Stacy Herbert, tell us more.
Obviously, they're from the same exact crime family who run politics, geopolitics, the economy, finance, culture, whatever, because they use the same exact arguments. Let's look at the first one, which is a political headline. American citizen killed in Israeli raid. Shot 4 times in head. Now remember, the argument from Israel for shooting these activists is that, first of all, they were only using paint guns, and they were acting in self-defense. But according to the Anatolian news agency, U.S. citizen was shot at close range with 4 bullets to the head and 1 to the chest.
Yeah, and who did it?
Well, according to a U.S. State Department official, he said the victim had been shot, but, quote, it was not clear who shot him.
Well, I think we can rule out Ariel Sharon.
Let's take a look at the next part of the political mafia family. Bush's glib waterboarding admission sparks outrage. So apparently, in the last week, George Bush was speaking before an audience in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he said, quote, yeah, we waterboard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I'd do it again to save lives.
Well, yeah, I think what he meant to say, he'd do it again. He's got a book to sell.
Well, former intelligence and military officials argue that the former president doesn't seem to understand the gravity of what he is admitting. But of course he does, because he is the capo de capo, and he's saying, like, you in what army?
It's like that movie Team America, global police force. We need Alec Baldwin to save the world. No, I tell you, no one faces any kind of retribution for their criminal activity. Bush knows this. And we saw this last year. Remember, Rumsfeld was in France visiting Paris, and under international law, he should have been arrested and thrown in The Hague immediately for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the French government, of course, who cares, war crimes.
So we're going to move on to the financial front now of the crime family. Buffett's PR disaster. America's love affair with the Oracle goes poof. Warren Buffett, the richest man in the world, testifying before Congress, forced to testify before Congress, I might add, because he refused to show up.
You got a subpoena.
Regarding the Moody's, and which he owns 13% of the company.
Of course.
So regarding the rating agency's role in the financial disaster. Now look at this little clip when he's testifying before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission.
Wasn't the role of the rating agencies, though, to be referees in a game that got out of control? You told our staff that, well, gee, if they had not done the ratings, they would have been howled at by Congress. But don't we expect referees to make the call, even if they're going to get booed?
Yeah, and they made the wrong call.
So they made the wrong call. Now, so it's just a little misunderstanding, right? Now, check out this. Phil Angelides now being interviewed by Bloomberg following the testimony.
I think it's clear they were central in it. Look, Moody's rated 46,000 or 42,000 securities AAA from 2000 to 2007, 9,000 alone in 2007. And, 80 to 90% of these were downgraded from investment grade to junk status.
So 80 to 90% failure rate is just a little mistake. It's it's not fraud. It's not a big disaster.
Yeah, they misrated 42,000 securities.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a pretty bad track record. Of course, I liken this to what I call reverse drug dealing, because remember, the AAA-rated bonds are used to package and resecuritize with rank junk by firms on Wall Street like Goldman Sachs, who then sells it to pension funds, and they have, we've got some of these AAA-rated bonds as well. They cut, like drug dealers cut, with baby laxative into the cocaine. They cut their junk with AAA-rated bonds, thanks to Moody's, and then they put it into a pension account. And then, 42,000 of these bonds, they're actually worthless, are close to worthless, and those pension funds are now taking a huge hit. And the savers and the workers get, of course, eviscerated, while the borrowers and the speculators and the rating agencies and Warren Buffett are complicit in what should be considered a racket. It's racketeering. They won't stop this until they use anti-racketeering, and Buffett's in the racket.
Well, let's point out that Warren Buffett is the richest man in the world, and he got that way through investing, what he calls value investing. So he allegedly knows how to seek value in a company. And here's the richest man in the world, via his investments, saying, I couldn't have possibly known, this is what he told the committee, I couldn't possibly have known there was a housing bubble and that it was all fraudulent. I didn't know. And here's a direct quote from famous value investor Warren Buffett. We own a lot of Procter & Gamble, but I don't know much about the inner workings of Procter & Gamble, one of their largest holdings. So he's saying, I don't know about Procter & Gamble, so why should I know about Moody's, my other investment?
Why should I know about anything? He's got fraud blindness. Now, he's definitely in the top 5 of the richest guys in the world, that's for sure. And he's got tens of billions of dollars to his name. And apparently he got that way by giving himself a case of fraud blindness. This is a disease where you can't see the fraud. It's similar to selective amnesia, which a disease from Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, where they simply can't remember defrauding people out of billions. This is similar. It's also part and parcel with another disease that goes with fraud blindness. It's called fraud deafness, and it's a part of a complex of diseases that we see in the certain echelon of American and global business.
Well, it's also outrageous. He could be just as outrageous as Israel saying, you know what, we were just using paintball guns. These guys that are out dead, they must be playing dead because we only use paintball guns. And he's saying, I'm the value investor, the richest guy in the world, and I didn't know what I was doing. Well, this takes us to the rest of the economy and the BP oil spill. Gulf oil spill. BP lacked the right tools to deal with crisis, chief executive admits. Apparently, the golf balls, tires, and the saw didn't work. And yet, this is a guy, Tony Hayward, he made £998,000 as a salary in 2008 and a bonus of £1,496,000. And remember, we're told we have to pay these guys this much money because otherwise all this extreme talent will go somewhere else.
Well, you know, Tony Hayward lacks the tools to do his job correctly. Amongst the tools missing over there would be a moral conscience. He lacks that as well. And he also lacks really good public relations company to help him navigate his way into this PR disaster. Not that BP will ever have to suffer any economic consequences, or Tony Hayward will not become, if he's not already, a knight or a lord over there in Britain, because they seem to bestow a knighthood to the biggest charlatans in the business community, Lord Snootypuss and Lord Haywood, and he'll be in the House of Lords before we know it. But this is an important key point to remember, is that failure is rewarded. That's the business model that runs the U.S. economy, the UK economy, and really the global economy.
Okay, and then we move on to the other similarity between the Moody's role and the rating agency's role in the financial disaster, when Warren Buffett, the richest man in the world, the richest investor in the world, said, oh, you know, nobody could possibly have known. And he was questioned, well, there were people like Nouriel Bini or Schiller, a lot of people predicted it. And he said, well, those were just doom and gloomers. Well, here's exactly. So
fraud blindness.
Fraud blindness.
Your foot just got ripped off by a car. Well, it's a flesh wound. It's like that Monty Python sketch where the knight gets his arm cut off and his leg cut off, and he's still fighting. No, I'm fine. Everything's great. Here, Warren Buffett's caught red-handed defrauding people out of billions, and he's like, it's nothing. It's the course of business. It's normal. It's like he's got that Jackie Mason reaction. What? Me? It could have happened. I never saw it. I saw a memo. I never saw the memo. Fraud? I never did it. Who? I never saw it.
How BP MMS ignored spill warning signs. New documents released over the last week to the New York Times show that both BP and federal regulators at the Interior Department's Minerals Management Service had plenty of warning that the drilling operation was beset with troubles, including in the well and blowout preventers. Documents show that the company knew that there was, quote, unlikely to be a successful cement job, remember, which happened just a few hours before the whole thing blew up, on the site, and that the casing will be, quote, unable to fulfill MMS regulations. And yet, regardless, they went forward with the whole drilling.
Well, there's your mafia analogy. Mafia famously putting cement shoes to try to bury the problems. There's BP trying to put a cement collar, trying to bury this problem. But I was just reading on the web this morning that BP still hopes to make money from this bill by capturing globs of oil and processing it off. in their processing ship, and it's just the cost of doing business.
Presumably then, and we've seen this in the third world, that the local people who try to defend their own property will get arrested or sued for stealing the profits of BP. But I want to take you on to the next headline about this outrage by the local citizens, by the people of the world against BP. And we've seen the outrage against Bush and his admission. We see outrage against Warren Buffett and his admissions. Now, Gulf oil spill, BP to go ahead with $10 billion shareholder payout. So Tony Hayward is defying calls from politicians to cancel the dividend until this spill is resolved.
Yeah, well, of course, because the savers out there now, finally they say the savers need their dividend, and many savers in the UK own BP stock. It's a core portfolio holding in UK pension accounts, and suddenly they care about the savers. But the same people who might be wanting to take some kind of leisurely break on the beach this summer when the spill gets into the Gulf Stream and carries it up to Britain, who are going to be covered in gook, no, we don't care about that.
Yeah, but Max, this was used by everybody. Goldman Sachs defied Obama and paid out billions in bonuses, even though he said not to. Israel defied the White House by killing the activists. So, everybody's going to what? Pretend to be morally outraged.
Yeah, it's important to be able to pretend moral outrage in this global economy and media space, especially when, like Israel, it's amazing that they, within the first 24 hours, they were able to clamp down on the global media space, including social networking sites, to put out their basic party line of propaganda and to put this defiance message out there. And it's quite something, actually. You would think that there would be more journalistic integrity in the world.
Well, speaking of moral outrage, the big outrageous character of the past year, of the financial crisis, certainly is Goldman Sachs. And they're in my headline. Goldman Sachs sold $250 million of BP stock before spill. And I'm sure Goldman Sachs knew nothing, just like the theme of the show. So apparently, just before the spill, Goldman Sachs, according to rawstory.com, sold 4,680,822 shares of BP in the first quarter of 2010.
Yeah, I'm sure that a year from now, it'll emerge a scandal that Goldman Sachs actually sold that stock after the spill, but they used backdating of sales and they used their market rigging techniques and the fact that the compliance department at the firm is in bed with the executives at the firm and there is no effective securities enforcement on Wall Street. We'll find out that they actually sold it after the spill, and then they'll say, yeah, you caught us, and they'll pay a little fine, and it's the cost of doing business, and they're defrauding billions out of people, and that's what they do every single day, and they're still allowed to continue unchecked in the economy, even though they're draining it of its integrity and its liberties and its vitality, and we'll soon have to wave, bye-bye, America. Goldman totally destroyed you. Bye. We loved you when you were here, but adios, muchachos. All right. Well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more right after this. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time to welcome to the program Dr. Michael Hudson, an economist who is the chief of the committee of experts of the Renew Latvia Task Force. Dr. Hudson has just returned from Riga, where he presented a third option to the annual meeting of the Harmony Center Coalition. Dr. Michael Hudson, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max.
Okay, now, before we get into what you presented to the annual meeting of the Harmony Center Coalition in Riga, can you give us a brief outline of the state of the Latvian economy and how it got there?
The Latvian economy is the hardest hit of all of the post-Soviet economies. Its GDP has plunged by 20%, and its wage rates in the public sector have fallen by 30%. We met with the central banker, and he promised that he would reduce wages and living standards even more, with the intention of plunging wages and living standards in the private sector. Latvia believes that the lower priced its labor is, the quicker the economy can recover. The problem is that Latvia has saddled itself with the most unequal tax system in the entire world. The taxes on employment are more than 51%. So labor in Latvia costs employers more than labor in any other country, although it's the worst paid. That's the irony, that the whole labor is taxed, but the tax on property, if you can imagine, is 0.1%. Property owners and speculators don't have to pay a tax, and this is why there's been an enormous real estate bubble in Latvia, and why real estate prices have plunged by 70% in many areas. Most of the property values that have plunged have left property owners and mortgagees, homeowners, with negative equity. And in Latvia, they're personally liable for the debts. Not only that, but when I met with the bank regulators during the week, they said they'd agreed with the banks that instead of basing mortgage loans on the value of property, they base it on all of the income that the mortgagee can have, and the mortgagee's children, and the mortgagee's parents, and the homeowner's aunts, and uncles, and nieces, and nephews. Entire families, apparently, are held liable for debts that have now fallen 70%, negative equity, so the population basically is being reduced to debt peonage. The result is that immigration from Latvia is accelerating. Marriages rates have fallen off. Fertility rates have plunged. There's a demographic crisis reflecting the economic crisis. And now that the bubbles burst, there's no more mortgage lending that is coming in to support the Latvian currency. So the central bank has borrowed from the European Union and the IMF, and the condition on which it's borrowed is the European Union said, we want to make sure that none of this money we're lending you is used for Latvian development. We're going to lend you money not to develop the economy, but lending you the money to tell you, close down your schools, close down your medical care, close down your ambulance servants, streamline your agencies, run a budget surplus despite the fact that your economy is falling into the worst recession of any post-Soviet economy anywhere in the world.
All right, Dr. Michael Hudson, I want to go global here for a second, because Latvia is just one piece of a global picture, and you've written about this extensively on michael-hudson.com, which is also an excellent place to get information. But what I want to touch upon here is what we've talked about before, savers versus speculators. Now, in the Latvian economy and in economies all over the world, Iceland, Ireland, Greece, artificially low interest rates, and speculators go in, they ramp up the debts to astronomical levels, and then they get the locals to pay out all these bad debts. You've talked about it in terms of the FIRE economy, which represents finance, insurance, and real estate, which is a non-productive part of the economy. Can you talk a little bit, because people who are not in Latvia, they might be in Ireland or Iceland or the United States, which is soon to be facing similar, or is facing similar quandaries and problems. Can you talk a little bit about this, the macro picture here, the savers versus speculators, as I call it, if you agree with me that that's kind of the dynamic we're talking about here?
I think you're quite right. That is the dynamic. I'll give you an example. When the Greeks rioted a few weeks ago, the advocates of Greece's borrowing more and Greece austerity program said, why can't you behave like Latvians? The Latvians don't riot. They seem to support the government. And the reason I'm talking about Latvia is that is being held up as a model, not only for Greece, but for the other pig countries. So what is happening in Latvia is a kind of dress rehearsal for the squeeze that's in, just as the Chicago boys in Chile were the dress rehearsal for Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to apply the Pinochet policies in the 1980s.
Okay, so in other words, yeah, exactly. So in Chile, under Pinochet, which of course under the tutelage of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, which is part of this thing called the neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus, it brought absolute misery to the local population. And it's so what you're saying, and you're there in Latvia, and your goal is to try to snap these people out of this delusion, because as a way to maybe start a domino effect to get other people in other countries who are now teetering choosing between this debt peonage as you call it, and something else which would be more beneficial to the people.
This is exactly right. You use the word domino effect, and apparently Sweden has told Latvia, we've got to save you. You're the domino, and if you go, all the post-Soviet economies go. The domino effect is that Greece and these other countries are being faced with a false choice. They're being told, either you devalue, which is unthinkable because Greece would have to leave the European currency area if it devalued, or the alternative to devalue is an austerity plan to squeeze labor and reduce living standards, cancel, reduce pensions, reduce Social Security, reduce education, reduce health care, and reduce social spending. So the fact is, that's a false alternative. The fact that Latvian labor is taxed by more than 51% means the government can shift the tax off labor and immediately cut the wages cost to employers by 50%. They can cut the cost of labor in half without reducing living standards. By taking this tax and shifting it onto the land, onto the property, onto monopolies, an economic rent tax of the sorts that the real liberals originally held in the 18th and 19th century. The physiocrats, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, the progressive era reformers, the early social democratic parties and the labor parties all backed the kind of liberalism that says tax away the free lunch, bring prices in line with the actual cost value. So that means you don't want to tax labor, and you don't want to tax industry, and you don't want to tax agriculture because that increases the price of labor and the price of capital. You don't want to tax value-added products or sales because that increases the sales price. But if you tax the land, that leaves less of the rental revenue, the free lunch revenue, just from the site value that should belong to the country. If you tax the land, this revenue is not available to be pledged to the banks. And so the problem is that right now, the existing choices that Greece and the other European countries are all faced with, there's an attempt to make it appear as if there's going to be a disaster if they don't bail out the banks and if they don't cut back living standards and pensions. So they've turned real liberalism upside down. They say industry and agriculture should be run to subsidize the rentiers, to subsidize the banks, to subsidize the speculators. These are exactly the sectors that progressive economics and reform economics from Adam Smith on, classical economics is all about preventing revenue going to these sectors, either by keeping monopolies in the public domain and providing their services at a low price to keep the economy competitive, or if you're going to have privatization, you want to regulate monopoly prices so there's no price gouging by high telephone fees or other fees, and you want to tax away the land rent. So, because if that's pledged to the bank, then all you're going to do is use this natural land rent, monopoly rent, to collateralize for debt, to capitalize into debt, and to load the economy down with debt, and that's what's happened. There's another needless cost that Latvia and Greece and all of the European countries have, that under the Maastricht criteria, central banks are not allowed to behave as central banks. They do what central banks usually do, act as lobbyists for the commercial banks, act as lobbyists for the foreign banks. But what they're not allowed to do is create credit to finance the government budget. In effect, the central banks of the Maastricht countries in Europe are only currency boards. They're not allowed to create credit. They simply tell the government, if you run a deficit, you have to borrow from our clients, the commercial banks. You have to load down the economy with interest charges and the government budget with interest charges instead of funding and monetizing the debt, which is how America got rich, Britain got rich, Germany got rich, Japan got rich, China has got rich. Every developed country had an active central bank that saves the government money, not costs the government money.
Going back to liberal economics of Adam Smith's day, when capitalism made up of two major components, labor and capital, when labor had some leverage in that economy, over the past 200 years, we're at a state where now labor has no leverage. Capital and all the speculation that go with capital is now dictating all the terms for the economy up and down. Labor's got no leverage whatsoever. Latvians are now at the cutting edge of a global movement toward debt peonage, and the only hope is that their strong consumer protection laws might be able to away for a wedge that labor can get back in there and rebalance their economy. My last question is is that going to be enough to rebalance the economy in Latvia, or is Latvia basically a goner?
It doesn't have to be a goner. The tax reform is the first step. When you say capital, it's really finance capital you're talking about, not industrial capital. The first thing the neoliberals did in Latvia was tear down the factories. Latvia was a computer center of the Soviet Union. Latvia was the most middle class, the highly educated, literate population. They took the factories and they sold them for junk. So this is not a pro-industrial capital program. Latvia needs to rebuild the industrial capital that's been destroyed by finance capital, whose lobbyists are the neoliberals.
Right, okay, so finance capital, again, so that transition point where, again, getting back to the Chicago School and neoliberal thinking, is that industrial capital made way to financial capital and the rise, really, of the speculator king in the economy. Now, Dr. Michael Hudson, I know the Latvians are highly appreciative that you're there trying to right the economy, and we've been tracking this on our end, and we hope to continue to track this because, as you say, this is really ground zero for pushing back against this debt peonage that's being pushed all over the world by various economies and Wall Street bankers and bankers. But we're going to have to cut it off now, this particular issue, and I want to thank you so much for being on the Keiser Report, Dr. Michael Hudson.
Thank you very much, Max.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and Dr. Michael Hudson. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.